The town of Blackridge had a way of swallowing people whole, chewing up their names, their dignity, and spitting them back out as rumors. It was a place where silence carried judgment, and every glance held a story no one dared to say aloud. On a cold, dust-choked afternoon, the townsfolk gathered in the square, not for celebration, not for justice, but for spectacle. At the center stood a trembling young woman in a faded dress, her eyes hollow yet burning with something deeper than fear. They called her the Shamed Bride, a label stitched onto her soul without trial or mercy. No one asked what really happened. No one cared. Her name was Alara, but the town had long forgotten it. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the square, cold and mechanical, as if he were selling livestock instead of a human life. $1, he called out, and laughter rippled through the crowd like poison. That was all she was worth to them, less than a meal, less than a drink. And then, just when the humiliation seemed unbearable, a voice cut through the noise, calm, firm, unshaken. "I'll take her." Heads turned. A stranger stepped forward, his coat worn but his posture unbreakable. He placed a $1 on the table, not as a bargain, but as a declaration. And in that moment, everything began to change. No one in Blackridge knew the man's name, and that alone made them uneasy. Outsiders didn't stay long in a town built on secrets, yet this man walked as if he belonged to something far greater than their small, suffocating world. His eyes met Alara's, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something she hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. It confused her, unsettled her even more than the cruelty she had grown used to. The crowd whispered, their voices dripping with suspicion. Why would anyone buy her? He must not know what she's done. But the stranger said nothing. He simply turned, gesturing for Alara to follow. For a moment she hesitated, unsure whether she was stepping into salvation or another kind of prison. But anything was better than the square, better than the eyes that stripped her of her humanity. So she walked. Step by step, away from the place that had condemned her without a voice. Behind them, the laughter faded, replaced by a silence heavy with disbelief. Because in Blackridge, no one rescued the broken. No one believed in second chances. And yet, someone just had. The road out of town stretched long and empty, the dust rising beneath their feet like ghosts of the past trying to cling to them. For hours, neither of them spoke. The man walked ahead, steady and deliberate, as if he already knew where they were going. Finally, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bruised shades of red and gold, Alara found her voice. "Why?" she asked, her tone fragile yet edged with defiance. "Why would you buy me?" The man stopped, turning to face her fully for the first time. His gaze was not soft, but it wasn't cruel either. It was honest, piercing, and unwavering. "Because," he said quietly, "you were never meant to be sold." The words hit her harder than any insult she had endured. They carried weight, truth, and something dangerously close to hope. But hope was something Alara had learned to fear. Because in Blackridge, hope was always the first thing they took from you. They reached a small cabin hidden at the edge of a forest where the world felt quieter, untouched by the poison of Blackridge. It wasn't much, just weathered wood, a cracked window, and a roof that had seen better days. But to Alara, it felt like another world entirely. The man finally introduced himself as Rowan, though he offered no past, no explanation of how he came to be there. He moved with purpose, lighting a fire, setting water to boil, as if caring for another person was second nature to him. Alara watched cautiously, her instincts screaming that kindness always came with a cost. In her experience, nothing was ever given freely. Yet Rowan asked for nothing. Not her story, not her gratitude, not her obedience. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. Days passed in an uneasy silence, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the distant whisper of wind through trees. But slowly, something began to shift. For the first time in years, Alara was not being watched, judged, or defined by others. And that freedom felt heavier than chains. One evening, as shadows stretched long across the cabin walls, Rowan finally spoke about the town. "They fear what they don't understand," he said, his voice calm but laced with something deeper. Alara let out a bitter laugh. "They don't fear me," she replied. "They hate me." Rowan shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "Hate is easier. Fear requires truth." His words lingered in the air, unsettling her carefully built defenses. For so long she had accepted the town's version of her story, worn it like armor even though it cut her from the inside. But what if it wasn't true? What if the shame they forced on her was never hers to carry? The thought was dangerous, fragile, and yet impossible to ignore. That night, for the first time, Alara spoke. Not the whole story, not all at once, but enough for the silence between them to begin breaking. And Rowan listened. Not as a judge, not as a savior, but as someone who believed her voice mattered. The truth, when it finally came, was nothing like the rumors. There had been no betrayal, no scandal worthy of exile, only power, greed, and a lie told by the right people at the right time. Alara had been silenced because she knew something she wasn't supposed to know, something that could unravel the very foundation of Blackridge. Rowan listened without interruption, but his expression darkened with each word. When she finished, the weight of it hung heavy between them. "Then we go back," he said simply. Alara's heart froze. "Back?" she whispered, fear clawing its way into her chest. Rowan nodded. "They took your name, your voice, your truth, and they got away with it." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "That ends now." For the first time, Alara saw something in him that matched the storm inside her. A quiet, unyielding determination. And suddenly, the man who paid $1 for her didn't seem like a stranger anymore. He seemed like something far more dangerous, an ally. When they returned to Blackridge, the town didn't welcome them. It recoiled. Whispers spread like wildfire, eyes narrowing with suspicion and something darker. Fear. Because the shamed bride was never supposed to come back. And certainly not like this. Alara walked differently now, her steps no longer hesitant, her gaze no longer lowered. Beside her, Rowan was a silent force, his presence alone enough to unsettle the fragile balance of lies the town had built. They went straight to the square, the same place where her life had been reduced to a single $1. But this time, she stood not as an object, not as a victim, but as someone ready to be heard. The crowd gathered again, drawn by curiosity, by anger, by the desperate need to protect their version of the truth. And when Alara finally spoke, her voice did not shake. She told them everything, not as a plea, not as a defense, but as a truth that refused to be buried any longer. The names, the lies, the hidden deals that had turned her into a scapegoat. At first, the crowd resisted. Denial is a powerful thing, especially when the truth threatens to expose everyone's silence as complicity. But Rowan stepped forward, revealing proof that could not be ignored. Documents, records, things the town's leaders thought would never see the light of day. The foundation of Blackridge began to crack, and with it, the certainty that had kept Alara chained for so long. Faces changed, whispers turned, and slowly, painfully, the weight of shame shifted away from her. By the time the sun set, Blackridge was no longer the same town. Truth had a way of doing that, of tearing down what was built on lies and forcing something new to rise from the ruins. Alara stood in the square one last time, but this time, no one dared call her shamed. Her name echoed instead, her real name, spoken not with pity, but with something closer to respect. She turned to Rowan, the man who had paid $1 for her as if it were the highest price in the world. "Why did you really do it?" she asked softly. Rowan smiled, just slightly. "Because," he said, "some things aren't meant to be valued by the world, only protected from it." And as they walked away together, leaving Blackridge to reckon with its past, one truth remained clear. She had never been worth $1. She had been priceless all along. Blackridge did not heal overnight. Truth, once revealed, does not quietly settle. It shakes foundations, fractures loyalties, and forces people to confront the versions of themselves they've long avoided. In the days that followed Alara's return, the town was restless, like a storm that hadn't yet decided where to break. Some people avoided her entirely, unable to face what their silence had cost. Others watched her from a distance, curiosity battling guilt in their eyes. But there were also those who began to change, slowly, awkwardly, unsure of how to rebuild something they had helped destroy. Alara noticed all of it, but she did not let it define her anymore. For the first time, she wasn't living in reaction to the town. She was simply living. Yet even as a fragile sense of peace tried to take root, something deeper lingered beneath the surface. Because the truth she had revealed wasn't just about her. It had exposed powerful people who had everything to lose. And people like that didn't disappear quietly. Rowan sensed it before Alara did. The subtle shifts, the way conversations stopped when he walked by, the way certain doors remained closed a little too long. One evening, as the sky darkened into a heavy, suffocating gray, he stood at the edge of the town, watching the horizon like a man expecting trouble. "It's not over," he said quietly when Alara approached. She frowned, her instincts tightening. "What do you mean?" Rowan didn't answer immediately, and that silence said more than words ever could. "The people you exposed," he finally said. "They didn't just lose their power. They lost control." Alara felt a chill crawl up her spine. "And people who lose control," she began. Rowan nodded. "Do dangerous things to get it back." The air between them grew tense, heavy with unspoken understanding. Whatever came next wouldn't be whispers and rumors. It would be something far more direct and far more dangerous. That night, the attack came. It wasn't loud at first, just the distant sound of footsteps, too many to ignore, moving with purpose through the dark. Rowan reacted instantly, pulling Alara away from the window just as glass shattered inward. Shadows flooded the cabin, figures cloaked in anger and desperation. These weren't just townsfolk. They were men sent to silence a problem, permanently. But Rowan wasn't unprepared. There was a precision to the way he moved, a quiet efficiency that spoke of a past he had never shared. He fought not with rage, but with control, each movement calculated, each step deliberate. Alara watched in stunned realization. This man who had bought her freedom was no ordinary stranger. And as the attackers retreated, leaving chaos in their wake, one truth became undeniable. The battle for her name was never just about the past. It was about survival. And it had only just begun. The morning after the attack, Blackridge could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. The violence had shattered whatever illusion of stability remained. People whispered again, but this time, not about Alara. They whispered about fear, about consequences, about the realization that the truth had awakened something they couldn't control. Alara stood in the ruins of the cabin, staring at the broken pieces of what had once been her refuge. But instead of feeling defeated, she felt something else rising within her, something stronger than fear. Resolve. "They want me to run," she said quietly. Rowan, standing beside her, studied her expression. "Will you?" he asked. Alara shook her head slowly. "No," she replied. "I ran once. I won't do it again." There was no hesitation in her voice now. No trace of the girl who had stood trembling in the square. Whatever Blackridge had tried to take from her, it had failed. Rowan finally revealed part of his past that day, not because he wanted to, but because Alara needed to understand the reality they were facing. He wasn't just a wanderer. He had once been part of something larger, a man who dealt with people like the ones now coming after them. "I know how they think," he said, "and I know what they'll do next." Alara listened carefully, piecing together the man who had remained a mystery for so long. "Then we stop them," she said firmly. Rowan met her gaze, searching for doubt, but found none. Instead, he saw strength. Not borrowed strength, not something he had given her, but something that had always been there, buried beneath years of silence. And in that moment, he realized something important. He hadn't saved her. He had simply reminded her of who she already was. Their plan wasn't simple and it wasn't safe, but it was necessary. The people behind the lies weren't just hiding in Blackridge anymore. They had connections, influence that stretched beyond the town's borders. If Alara wanted true freedom, she couldn't just reclaim her name. She had to dismantle the system that had stolen it. Together, she and Rowan began gathering what remained: evidence, allies, fragments of truth that could no longer be ignored. And as they moved forward, something shifted between them. It wasn't just partnership. It was trust, forged not through words, but through everything they had faced together. Because sometimes the strongest bonds aren't built in moments of peace, but in the fires of everything trying to break you. The final confrontation didn't happen in secret. It happened where everything had begun. The square. The same place where Alara had once been reduced to a price tag. But this time, the crowd gathered for a different reason. Not for spectacle, not for judgment, but for truth. The people who had orchestrated the lies stood exposed, their power stripped away piece by piece. And for the first time, they looked small, human, afraid. Alara stepped forward, not with anger, but with clarity, because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about ending something that should have never begun. When the truth was finally laid bare, fully, undeniably, there was no room left for denial. The system that had protected lies collapsed under its own weight, and the people who had once controlled the narrative were forced to face the consequences they had so carefully avoided. But what mattered most wasn't their downfall. It was what came after. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was different. It was the kind of silence that comes when something broken finally stops pretending to be whole. As Alara stood there, no longer the shamed bride, no longer defined by anything the town had tried to make her, she understood something she hadn't before. Her worth had never been tied to their acceptance, their judgment, or their forgiveness. It had always been hers. Rowan stepped beside her, not as a protector, not as a savior, but as someone who had walked beside her long enough to know she didn't need one anymore. "What now?" he asked. Alara looked out at the town, not with resentment, but with quiet strength. "Now," she said softly, "we build something better." And as the sun rose over Blackridge, casting light over a place that had once thrived in shadows, one truth stood unshaken. She had never needed to be saved. She had only needed to be seen. Blackridge was no longer the same town, but that didn't mean it was a better one. Not yet. Truth had cleared the rot, but what remained was uncertainty. Structures of power had collapsed, leaving behind a fragile emptiness no one quite knew how to fill. Some tried to rebuild quickly, eager to move on as if nothing had happened. Others hesitated, afraid that any step forward might lead them back into the same darkness. And in the middle of it all stood Alara, not as a ruler, not as a symbol, but as someone people had begun to look toward. That unsettled her more than anything. She had fought to reclaim her voice, not to become the voice of others. Yet every decision she made, every step she took, seemed to ripple through the town. It was a quiet kind of power, the kind she never asked for, and wasn't sure she wanted. Because she understood something most people didn't. Power, even when given with trust, could become a burden just as heavy as shame. Rowan noticed the shift before she spoke it aloud. "You're carrying them," he said one evening, as they stood overlooking the town from a ridge just beyond its borders. Alara didn't deny it. "They're lost," she replied. "Someone has to guide them." Rowan shook his head slightly, his expression thoughtful but firm. "Guiding isn't the same as carrying," he said. "If you take all their weight, they'll never learn to stand on their own." His words struck deeper than he intended, because Alara recognized the truth in them, and the danger. She had spent so long being powerless that now, even the idea of letting go felt wrong. But she also knew what it meant to be controlled, to have someone else decide your worth, your direction, your future. And she refused to become that for anyone else, even if they wanted her to. The decision came quietly, without ceremony. Alara stepped back, not completely, but enough. Instead of leading every conversation, she began asking questions. Instead of making choices for the town, she encouraged them to make their own. It wasn't easy. Some resisted, frustrated by the absence of clear direction. Others struggled, unsure how to move forward without someone telling them how. But slowly, something began to change. People started speaking up, taking responsibility, owning not just their past mistakes, but their future as well. And for the first time, Blackridge didn't feel like a place controlled by fear or silence. It felt alive, messy, uncertain, imperfect, but alive. And in that imperfection, there was something far more powerful than control. There was growth. Just as Blackridge began to find its footing, a new challenge emerged, one that didn't come from within, but from beyond. News of what had happened in the town had spread farther than anyone expected, and with it came attention. Outsiders began arriving, not as wanderers like Rowan once had, but as opportunists, traitors, officials. People drawn not by curiosity but by the chance to take advantage of a town still rebuilding itself. They saw vulnerability where others saw recovery, weakness where others saw transformation, and they intended to use it. Ilara watched it unfold with growing concern. This was a different kind of threat, not lies or hidden power, but something far more subtle. Influence, pressure, the kind that didn't force itself onto you, but slowly reshaped you until you didn't recognize what you had become. One of them stood out above the rest, a man named Corvin, polished, articulate, and dangerously persuasive. He spoke of progress, of opportunity, of turning Blackridge into something greater than it had ever been. And many people listened. After all, they wanted a better future. They wanted stability, growth, something to replace the chaos they had endured. But Ilara saw something others didn't. Control, hidden beneath charm. The same kind of control that had once destroyed her life, just dressed in different words. Rowan didn't trust him either. "He doesn't want to help this town," he said quietly. "He wants to own it." Ilara nodded, her instincts already warning her of the same thing. But this time, the danger wasn't.